In this lesson, we'll be trying to recreate this shader, this black old plastic that this vintage phone has. Obviously, it has the same characteristics as other plastics. Obviously, we have Fresnel, we have those nice multi-lobe specular, but it's not as apparent as the previous example, and we possibly can get by only using two layers. The diffuse, as you can see, is pretty even, and the reflections are also very strong and even, and the only thing that makes this looks too contrasty and old is the contrast in the specular roughness. So if I, for example, zoom in here, you can see in this part we have very rough specular highlights, and here it's getting very sharp. So this is one characteristic that sets this material and shader apart, and I'll be trying to recreate this. And also, obviously, we have some dirts in these, nooks and crannies, for example, here over these edges, and we have some bright spots and scratches also in some of the parts. So we'll be trying to create those few layers. Let's get started. So this is the scene that we're going to be working with. I have about 3 other materials applied to this phone right now. A material for this wire, which is this one, a material for this part, and a material for the dial numbers here. And we'll be just trying to create the plastic part. I'm going to create a new Arnold standard shader. And let's name it plastic phone or whatever. Open it up. And I can just simply middle click on this. And one thing to mention, from this lesson, I will be working with the public and official release of 1.0.14.1. So hopefully it's more stable than the beta version, and you will have access to also. They just released this version. So let's start working on this material. Obviously, the first thing we want it's going to be a noise. We're going to be working on the diffuse. So as we did with the previous material, I'm just going to be using a simple noise. Let's apply this material to the phone here, and let's press Ctrl-Shift-V and run our IPR so we can see the noise on our object here. Okay, so let me, for starters, increase the scales maybe to something like 3. Let's increase the octaves to 3. That's way too much. Let's go to 2. And let's increase the distortion to something like 0.5, 0.2. Let's see, 0.25 should be enough. And to control the color of our noise, we're going to be using a mix node, obviously. I'm going to select the mix node, drag it, hold down Alt, and release it and say insert after, and then it's going to be the noise is going to be the mix amount of our mix map. So now I'm going to select this mix node, and obviously, as you saw from the picture, the diffuse color is pitch black, so we're going to be using very, very dark colors. So let's, for the first color, use something like 5, 5, and 5, and for the second color, maybe 10, 10, and 10. Let's see. I hope you see the difference in the diffuse. It's really hard to see, and because after recording it would be even harder. I can go ahead and maybe use a brighter colors like 20, and you can see now it's quite obvious the difference, but I really want that pitch black, so let's go to something like maybe 13, 14, 15, something like that. Press OK. That's better. So this is the first layer of our diffuse. And just to make it a bit more interesting, as we did with our previous material, I'm going to just add some dirt and basic irregularity to this map by using an image node. Let's use maybe this image here. I'm going to open it up and see it on my phone. Let's run the IPR. So that's good, but I really don't want to have that very dark spots. We just want to use a ramp float node here. So let's drag insert after as the input, And I'm just going to select this first point and increase the Y value until the dark parts are no longer that dark, something like this. And now we need a layer color node to combine our noise and this image that we just have. And also, actually, if I select the image and go to the UV coordinates, I think I'm going to increase the repetition, maybe something like 3, maybe 2. And this image is going to be very subtle, so it really doesn't matter that much. So let's use a layer color node to combine these two guys. So the mix node is going to be the first layer, and these guys, the image is going to be the second layer here. I'm going to select my layer color node and connect it to the Arnold Beauty port, increase the layer 1 alpha, and for the layer 2, let's first change it to multiply. And if you take a look, I think it adds just too much, and I really want a very subtle effect, maybe something like 0.5, 0.4. Okay, that's great. Now we're going to be connecting this layer color to our diffuse color and connect this standard shader. So now we can actually start. I can also increase the diffuse weight for the standard shader. Now we can take a look at the specular weight and specular roughness. So let's start, just increase the size here. I'm gonna go ahead and just optimize my environment a bit. There we go. So for the specular weight and the specular roughness and the bump, we're going to be using one single image. But the fact here is when the shaders and the materials and the surfaces ages, it's, you know, you see the same pattern getting maybe, you know, the same texture, we can say, in the specular weight and the specular roughness in the bump. I mean, you can add some variations in different spots, but regularly and normally you use just one master shader, one master texture that controls all the parts of your shader. And this is a good example that we can actually see how we can do that. So let me just lay down a simple image node here. And in this case, you can use, you know, whatever texture that you can, you know, find it a bit closer to be able to kind of repeat or create some pattern like what we see here. But in this case, let's see what we have here. I think this shader is a good example. It has some nice pattern. We get scratches and you know, bigger patches, smaller patches, different colors. So I think this is a very irregular and nice image. So let's just lay it down. Now, as I mentioned in the starting points of this lesson, the reflection and the specular weight basically of this shader is even. If I connect this image directly to the specular weight and just let's see it on our, make sure it's applied nicely. I think it's enough. Great, I don't want to change anything actually. Now if I just connect this standard shader right now, let me just go to the standard shader and change some of the settings. So first of all, I want to use GGX. Let's turn on Fresnel, go to the refraction, turn on Fresnel, use IOR, and let's use something like 2. It's a good number for a plastic like this. So if I just decrease the roughness for the time being, you can see this image will give us very uneven specular weights, which is not exactly what we want. We want this unevenness to appear more on our specular roughness, right? So to control the contrast of this image, as always, we're going to be using a ramp float node. So let me just hold down Alt, insert after as the input. And using this guy, now I can simply go ahead and decrease the contrast. So I can actually see the ramp float node directly, just to see it a bit better. So let's And the overall amount of reflection, I mean, for example, in this case, we want a specular weight like 50%. So if we were just working with the specular weight number, we would have used something like 0.5, 0.4. So we want these values to be around the same thing. So if I just come down here and just make the overall image a bit darker and decrease the overall contrast, maybe a bit, something like this. Now we have a lot, you know, the image is more even compared to the previous example. And now if I take a look at the shader that we have, you can see we get some unevenness, but it's not that obvious. But you can see some parts are more reflective, some parts are less reflective, and this is exactly what we want in this part of our shader. Now I want to use the same image actually to control my specular roughness. So if I come down here, let's see. Let's just wait for this render to be finished, and after that we can start working on our specular roughness. Okay, so this is our first specular weight, and as you can see, it introduces a lot to the shader. Let's start working on our specular roughness. I'm going to simply just duplicate this RAM float node here, use it, connect the image to the input of this, and connect this to the specular roughness. Now, before connecting, I mentioned that the contrast that we see in that image is coming from the specular roughness, basically. So this is the time that we actually introduce that contrast here. Let's get back here. So if I select this RAM float node and connect it directly here, I want to increase this contrast. So, and let's put this point a bit lower here, maybe something like 0.1, and let's increase maybe to something like 0.9, and see if I connect this to the specular roughness, what we will get. So that's our specular roughness, and let's connect the standard shader and see what we get. Now obviously you can see we have a lot more contrast in different parts of this shader. There you go. Just wait for it to be finished. I think the contrast is a bit too much compared to what we see in this image, and to adjust this I can select the RAM float node simply, and maybe I don't want to be that rough. Really, some parts are just way too rough compared to what we have in that image. So let's just decrease the overall amount of roughness to maybe something like 0.7. Okay, I think that's not too bad. You can see in these parts we see that beautiful contrast. Just let's wait for the IPR to be finished, and when it's done we can start talking about adding other layers. So the IPR is finished, and I think it's in these rougher parts it's just a bit too rough, and I can just decrease the overall amount of roughness. But remember, we're going to be adding another you know, specular layer, another standard shader right now that will be a lot sharper compared to this one, and combine this with this particular standard shader that we're working on right now. So this will get less rough and more sharp, but just for the time being I'm just going to decrease this volume maybe to something like this would be possibly better, about 0.6. Okay, and then we can add this if we want to you know, increase it if we wanted to later on. But for the time being, so this is our first standard shader. Basically we don't need to go that crazy. I think that would be enough for this first layer. For the second layer, what I'm going to do is to simply duplicate this standard shader, and this is the layer that's we're going to be using basically for that multi-lobe specular highlight, for having those blooming specular highlights like we did in our previous lesson. We're just going to make the specular roughness less and basically make this layer a bit sharper, and then combine this with our base layer. So let me just control drag here, obviously the diffuse color is going to be coming from this, and this is going to be basically the master image. So I'm just going to duplicate this to ramp float node. The specular weight is going to stay the same for both of our layers, and the specular roughness is going to be sharper on this layer. So let me just connect that and connect this to the specular roughness and use this standard shader for the time being as our root. So what I'm going to do is to select the second ramp float, which controls the specular roughness for our second material, and open it in the separate window. And I'm just going to basically make it sharper. So maybe let's start with something like 0.2 maybe. As you can see, it's a lot sharper. And go to a small volume, maybe. Let's decrease it. Maybe to 0.5. Something around here. And I think we can increase this volume a bit. So as you can see, it's a lot sharper compared to our previous layer. Now we need to combine these two layers, right? Let's do that. So as we did previously, we're going to be using a utility node. I'm going to be doing this stuff a bit faster. So a complement node. We're just going to be using these nodes to control the blending. So this is going to be it's a composite node, sorry. That's the complement node, and as the input, let's quickly create a layer color node and put it right in there. This guy's a bit closer. So this is our first layer, which is our standard shader, our rougher standard shader, and this is going to be our second layer. And then I'm going to connect this directly and save this scene, increase the layer 1 alpha, and for the layer 2 alpha we're going to be using our utility and complement node, and I'm gonna increase. I've discussed the utility and the complement node and how they work, and if you're just watching this lesson directly or haven't watched the other lessons yet, we're just going to use these guys to control the layer 2 alpha based on the basically incidence angle or Fresnel. So use a ramp float node and insert after the complement node and use this as the layer 2 alpha here. Great. Now in order to combine these guys, so I'm going to increase this so our second standard shader will be more apparent also in the frontal angles and not only in the edges. Something like maybe 0.3, and go to something like that. So I guess, you know, that's enough. As you can see, now we have a combination of those two and we get those nice beautiful specular, multi-lobe specular highlights. Okay, that's great. Let me just save this and wait until the IPR is finished, and then we can start adding a bit dirt to these kind of nooks and crannies, and after that we can add those scratches and brighter spots. Okay folks, so the render is finished and I think we're in a good position. We have some nice contrast in our specular roughness, and in this part of the tutorial I want to add some, you know, dirt to these outer edges, to some of these deeper parts. So for that, I'm going to be using a curvature node. So make sure you're actually using release 1.014.0 or above, or you are not going to get this shader. So let's get started with this. First of all, this is the layer 2 alpha. Maybe we can just lay it down here. The third layer, first of all, let's create the dirt shader. It's going to be a very simple shader because obviously the only thing I'm going to actually change is just to add some roughness to this, really. Nothing too spectacular if I just press Ctrl-Shift-V and run the IPR. So it's a very simple standard shader layer with some roughness, right? Nothing special. Now, in order to combine this and just use it in these very, outer edges and deeper parts, we're going to be using, as I said, curvature shader. So let's lay down a curvature shader. So that's the curvature shader. And let's just, before doing this, apply this directly. So this is what basically is the output of the curvature shader. You basically create a mask, a black and white mask based on the curvature of your objects. You can have your convex areas or concave areas, you can see, or you can have both of these guys, right? And you can increase the samples and you can control the radius. So if I reduce the radius, maybe do something like this, and let's decrease the amount of spread. You can see it's very self-explanatory and very obvious effect. So let's just see what I want. If I decrease the bias, I'm going to actually go to something like this for the bias. And we have this multiply node, which basically increases or decreases the overall effect, which is very useful actually. So what I'm going to do for this curvature shader, this is actually the output I'm looking for, but I want to add some irregularity to these edges so they wouldn't be so perfect. And if you have worked with V-Ray, in V-Ray we have a dirt shader, which is kind of like this, even though it's different, it's like ambient occlusion. But in that V-Ray dirt shader, we have a slot called radius, and you can just apply a texture and have your dirt map be more irregular, right? And break that perfect, colors that you see here up. And for doing that, I'm going to be using actually multiply, and instead of a color, I'm going to, connecting a texture to this multiply node. So let's actually load an image node here. So that's going to be the image node. That's our standard shader, and let's just put these guys. This is our first layer, that the first node that controls the layer 2 alpha, and this is going to be controlling the layer 3 alpha. So I'm gonna connect this image to the multiply value, and let's load our image. Any of these images can work, but I think this 05 has some nice patterns here. So let's use that. And as you can see, immediately we get this image in a more irregular way. You can see the map is more irregular and has some breakups. Now, I don't want it to be this weak because it would be really hard to actually see the effect on our final shader. Let me just show you what I mean by that. So this is our third layer. So let's connect this. This is the layer that we just created, just a very simple standard shader to be used as our dirt. So this is going to be our layer 3, and this curvature is going to be our layer 3 alpha. So let's connect that to layer 3 alpha. Now if I wanted to actually see that dirt, and let's just to actually see it better, change the standard shader maybe to a more obvious color, maybe like that. You can see, make sure we're doing everything right. This is our being connected to the layer 3, and this is what controls our layer 3 alpha. Perfect. So you can see it's very hard to see actually any effect of the standard shader. And because, as I said, the output of our curvature shader is just so weak, in order to increase this, basically the power of this curvature shader and make it more obvious, we can maybe add an exposure, add a color correct node after this curvature node, and let's see if that works. So if I come here, use a color correct node, and let's just use it as the input and connect that, and I can maybe increase the exposure to something like 2, and as you can see, it will actually make the effect more powerful. So if I go to something like 3, but I like to use my RAM float node, so let's do that. So I'm going to lay down a RAM float node. Now, what we can do is to increase the contrast of this image that controls the multiply input of our curvature node, and by that increasing the, we can increase the overall effect of the curvature shader and make it more powerful. So if I just lay down this, and now we have this curvature node, this RAM float node, sorry. I'm going to reset that, and we need to drastically increase the contrast of this image. So let's see the white parts here. This is the black parts. Let's see what we want. So you can see there's just so much contrast here. Maybe something like that. Now, as you can see, it's way more powerful compared to the previous. And as you make these points closer together, you are basically increasing the contrast here. So maybe something like this wouldn't be too bad. Now let's see what we get if I connect the layer node. We should be able to see more of that effect. And if you take a look at these parts here, you start to see that kind of greenish standard shader showing up. And this is the amount you can see in all of these parts and sections. Right? Look at this part, look at these edges, and this is exactly what we want. Beautiful. Beautiful. And maybe even this color can work. It's like this is the standard shade that we have, and if I change it to the white color that we had before, we start to get a bit dirt-like effect. So there you go. These are actually the coming from our third layer, a layer that controlled by the curvature node. So that's actually very perfect. You can see we get these worn out edges in different places. So that's the next layer that we have. And finally, just to make it a bit more interesting, it's going to be a very simple layer. Just you can see some of these scratches here and there, and we're going to be adding this in our next layer. So let's do that. And for that, I'm gonna also, let's just take a look at the IPRs. You can see it's finished, and we get this beautiful dirts in different places. Now let's create our fourth layer, which is going to be the standard shader, and I'm just going to be using the same white color but increasing the weight and maybe adding some roughness here, and if I just connect this standard shader directly, you can see it's going to be a very basic layer. So some specular roughness, specular weight, and I'm going to make it very rough, 0.6 maybe. So that's going to be the layer, doesn't have to be anything specific. And to control this layer, it's gonna layer alpha. So let me just connect this layer to my layer 4, and we are going to be using an image to control its alpha. So let me use an image node, and the image we're going to be using is going to be the same image that we used for our previous example. If you remember, we used this to control the overall alpha of the, I think it was fourth or fifth layer there. But remember, if you're actually having these objects in the same scene, for example, if we had the bowling ball in the same scene, in this exact scene that we have our phone, and we use the same image to control the alpha of our, for example, scratches and spots layers, it would be very obvious. Now, because we are not having these guys in the same scene, I'm allowed to actually use the same texture to control, you know, the spots. Let me just show you what this layer is exactly controlling. So this is going to be controlling the layer 4 alpha. So there we go. And if I run the IPR and hopefully connect the layer here, also save the scene. Now you start to see this, you know, different spots, and for example, these scratches here and there. Let me make sure we're doing it right. So we have our layer 4 that's being controlled by the center shader, and we have our layer 4 alpha. Okay. So let's just wait for the IPR. So as you can see now, we get these very small spots. For example, this line here, this, you know, spot here. So this spot here. So those very, you know, very basic examples. This here, for example. So as I mentioned, if we had, for example, our bowling ball, we would get the exact same spots in here too, because we are using the same texture to control the alpha of a very similar layer, which is going to be these spots and, you know, scratches here and there. So because we are in the different scenes, we are actually, I'm allowed here to actually use the same texture. But if you are using, you know, these guys in these objects in the same scene, you need to actually use different textures. So the scene wouldn't be so obvious and CG. So that's our other layer. And finally, we can start adding the bump layer. Let me just, so this is the alphas here, and this is the 4 layer that we have, these guys. And perfect. Now let's start adding the bump. So let's lay down a bump node first. And the bump node is going to be a bit simpler this time. I'm gonna use a layer color to have my bump map. So the first layer actually I'm gonna use is gonna be this image node, but just to have a bit more control, if I wanted to adjust its contrast, I'm gonna lay down a ramp float node first. So let's connect this ramp float here, the image, the input after ramp float node, and then can come here, and this is going to be our first layer. And for the bump, if I just connect this image directly, I want to just to have less contrast. So let's just select this first point and increase the dark values and make them brighter. Maybe it's something like this. And for the second layer, I'm gonna use another image node, and this time I'm going to be using one of these scratchy, because it has obviously some scratches, our main image, maybe this. I'm going to be using this one, right? And if I connect this to the layer color, to select my layer color, increase layer 1 alpha, increase layer 2 alpha, and let's connect the layer color 2 to our node port. And I'm just going to select my layer color and change the layer to blending mode to multiply. So you get some of those, you know, scratches here and there. Now let's connect our main layer color to the bump map shader inputs. And this is going to be the bump map. So let's connect that. I'm going to save, connect the bump map to the Arnold's beauty port, and obviously we are going to start to see tons of bump mapping, which is just way too much for what we want, right? Just hold on shift and render this part. As you can see, the bump map is obviously way too much. So let's go to something like 1.1 here. You can see from this image, the bump map is very, you can see here, you can obviously see some bump mapping, but it's way smoother than what we have here still. I think I'm going to something like, let's say, maybe 0.05 instead of 0.1. And let's just take a look at these parts to see if bump map is actually working, or you can see its effects. Let's wait for it a bit. Okay, I really want it to be small, and obviously we have some bump mapping right now going up. I think the shader is basically finished here, and that's the network that we have created, right? This is our diffuse, guys. This is our first standard shader. This is the main image that controls basically everything. And let's wait for the I think it's good enough, and we can actually go ahead and render this out and see what we can do with our filter shader, and adjust some of the saturation or contrast, and see if we can get a better result finally. I'm gonna just stop this and save this and start rendering here. Just make sure my output is, let's go to something like 1000, 1200, 1200. On setting, I don't want to be so crazy. I'm just going to increase my camera samples something like 4, and ray depths is good enough. Maybe okay, I think that would be enough. So let me just save this, and I'm going to render this, and when the render is finished, I'll be back. So as it's rendering, guys, I actually realized the overall amount of bump mapping is just a bit too much. You can see it in here and in these parts. I guess we need a smoother surface compared to what we have right now. So what I'm going to do is to just open up this shader and go to the bump map and just decrease the bump height. Let's see, let me just zoom in these parts. Just hold on shift. I think we can go for something like 0.035, so it's a bit smoother. Let's just see it here maybe. So you can see you need to go back and forth to actually make your shader the way you like it. So let's just, so I think that's a lot better. That's a lot better. And one other thing maybe we can adjust is these thirds. I think they can be a little less effective. So if I just come down here to the curvature shader and select this node and just let's hold on shift, and what I can do is to make this contrast to be not that much. So now if you actually compare these to these parts, you can see now it's actually less powerful and less dirty compared to the and I think I like this a bit more. Okay, I think it's better compared to the right side. You can see it's not that dirty, and I think it's going to give us a better render. Perfect. Just going to reduce the overall size maybe to something like 1000 and 1000 here. There we go. And hopefully this time we will be having a better render. I'm just going to save it, and hopefully when the render is finished, I'll be back. So as you can see, the render is actually finished, and we have a nice render. Maybe we can go ahead and adjust different parts, and if you compare it to our image here, you can see it's maybe a bit blurrier compared to this image. Let me just load it again. There you go. But it's fairly close, and if you wanted to, we can simply go ahead and adjust the ramp float node that actually controls the roughness for both of our layers. Let me just actually come here and go to my filter tab, sorry, enable the filter and increase saturation maybe to something like 35 here. So that's 0, that's 35, and I'm just going to decrease the gamma again to something like 0.9, so we get more of that pitch black color in some of these parts. And as you can see, the shader is just really beautiful. You can see these edges and these dirts here. And the beautiful thing, so that's basically our render, and if you compare it, I think it's fairly close, even though I think this one has less roughness overall, but we get that nice contrasty look that we get, for example, sorry if I just zoom in here, this contrasty look, you can see we have it here, so that's good. And what's interesting about this shader that we just created is, if I wanted to change the entire look of this kind of shader, the only thing I need to do is just to replace one image. So if I just close this and let me duplicate this shader, and obviously I think I have a problem with my render. Some texture might be missing here. I had to, the Cinema 4D crashed and I had to actually relaunch it. But the beautiful thing, hopefully if we get one of these, there we go. So now the nice thing is, if I come here and take a look at this shader, if I change this image that basically controls the specular weight and roughness for our standard shader and also controls the bump here, I can get another result. So let's just lay down another image node here, and if I come here and let's, right now we're using image 32, I guess, and I don't know, let's for example use this image here. So if I just come here, and now we have loaded this image, and what I can do is just simply hold down Alt and release it on the main image and say move the outputs here. I think sorry, we need to do it because we're trying to move the output from this image node to this to the second image node. We just need to start here. So hold down Alt. If I'm not wrong, let's just make sure. So that's, hold down Alt, move the outputs. There we go. Now we're hopefully, so there, move the outputs. Now we're talking here. Now as you can see, the entire, if I just run the IPR here, let's press play. So now as you can see, we are basically getting another result. As you can see, the overall effect is different, and the way the specular roughness is distributed is also different. And I can come here and just, let's simply use another image, maybe I don't know, something like maybe image 08. We haven't applied this, sorry. Let's go and actually apply this material to see the changes. So now as you can see very quickly, you can see a very different results. Maybe this can be even closer to what we are looking for. So The beautiful thing about this shader, if you kind of develop your shader like this and try to use the same texture as much as possible, you get the ability to change your overall effect very quickly. You can see now we are getting a totally different result. Just actually before closing this lesson, I went ahead and actually rendered our scene using this texture instead of our main texture, which was, I think, this guy here, 32. So, and this is the result. So I just swapped this texture with this texture number 8. So if I open up my picture viewer, you can see this is the result that we're going to getting if we use the texture. So you can go ahead and actually apply different texture and see which one is going to get you the result that you're after, right? So that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I will see you in the next lesson.